I'm a historian of Black education, so almost everything that I write and publish deals with some aspect of Black educational history, whether talking about Black educators, whether looking at the work of Black parents, mobilizing to ensure that Black students had everything they needed to be successful, or whether looking at Black institutions and oftentimes the ways in which Southern white governments underfunded these institutions. So it was kind of second nature to begin this project, given my earlier work on Black colleges. Oftentimes when I tell people segregation scholarships, they say, I've never heard of that before. And I say it's okay because it's a term that I made up to describe the process of Southern states trying to preserve segregation at flagship institutions. So throughout the era of legal segregation, 16 Southern and border states used to provide funding for Black students to study in the North, the Midwest, and the West as a way of keeping Black students out of Southern flagships like the University of Georgia or the University of North Carolina. So oftentimes these segregation scholarships gave Black students the difference in tuition between the cost of studying at a Southern flagship and the cost of studying at an institution outside of the South. And so I call them segregation scholarships because the entire point of the state aid was to preserve segregation. I talk about in the book that most people are familiar with the Great Migration. We know that, large numbers of African Americans decided to essentially vote with their feet, right, and leave the South in search of better jobs, better educational opportunities for their kids, in search of the right to vote. And they relocate to urban areas in the North and the South, going to places like Memphis or Richmond and going to Detroit and Chicago and New York City. But one difference between this Great Migration and the educational migration that I write about is that the overwhelming majority, right, of segregation scholarship recipients come home. They saw their sojourn to the North as a temporary one. They went there to get an education, and once they got what they came from, they immediately came home. And this is important when we think of higher ed, or if we think of medicine, or if we think of law, because it was segregation scholarship recipients who were coming back home and becoming faculty members at Black colleges. It's segregation scholarship recipients who are opening up medical practices and law offices across the South, right? And so when we think of the Black middle class that we have in the South today, when we think of the Black professional class, really that foundation is laid in large part through these segregation scholarship recipients who are coming home. Audre Lorde had the famous quote, "The master's tools can never dismantle the master's house." And while I believe that's true, when I look at the experiences of segregation scholarship recipients, I began to say, well, the master's tools could perhaps upset the foundation of that house, because oftentimes the individuals who go north to pursue a master's degree or a PhD or an MD or a JD with state funding come back to the South and use their training, use their skills, use their credentials to begin to dismantle white supremacy in its various forms. Fred Gray is a native of Montgomery, Alabama. He wants to be an attorney. There's no law school in the state of Alabama for African Americans, so he goes to what's today Case Western Law School with funding from the state of Alabama. Even before he leaves home, he says, I'm coming back to Alabama and I'm going to sue this state every chance that I get. And Attorney Gray makes good on that promise, right? He graduates from law school in 1954, immediately comes back to Montgomery, sets up a law office in downtown Montgomery. He is thrust into the national spotlight in 1955 when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus. He becomes the attorney for the Montgomery Improvement Association, meaning he's the attorney for Martin Luther King, for Rosa Parks, for E.D. Nixon, for all of the African Americans who are going to be arrested and harassed by law enforcement during that year-long boycott. But even after the boycott is over, we see Fred Gray using his legal training to attack white supremacy. It would be Fred Gray who is going to desegregate over 100 of school districts in the state of Alabama. It's going to be Fred Gray who's going to be challenging gerrymandering in the state of Alabama. It's Fred Gray who represents the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And so while, yes, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, we know that his legal training that has opened up doors and expanded opportunity and protected the civil rights of Black Alabamians, all of that legal work, right, was subsidized by the state of Alabama. And perhaps Alabama's lawmakers had no idea that there was going to be this young black boy from Montgomery who was going to go to Ohio, get his law degree, come back to Alabama, and make a profession out of suing the state. You know, here in 2024, Attorney Gray is still practicing law. Most times, if you call his law office to speak to him, his secretary is going to say he's in court. The subtitle of the book talks about this debt that's owed to public HBCUs. And so I would like to explain why I believe that there's a debt owed to these institutions. I mentioned earlier that 16 states used money to compel Black students to leave home for anything beyond the bachelor's degree. Over half of those states paid for their segregation scholarship programs by taking money out of the operating budgets of their public Black colleges. So for every Black resident of Florida who leaves home for graduate or professional school study, the state of Florida paid for their segregation scholarship by taking that money out of FAMU's annual budget. The same is true of Tennessee. Every time a Black resident of Tennessee applied for a segregation scholarship to go out of state to receive the same opportunities that white residents could receive at UT Knoxville, the state of Tennessee paid for that by taking money out of Tennessee State's budget. And we're not talking small sums of money. In 1 year, I believe the year is 1949, the state of Florida spends $75,000 on segregation scholarships. If you put $75,000 in 1949 into 2024 dollars, we're talking a very significant six-figure sum in just 1 year. And so we have to talk about what this does, right, to these public Black institutions who are essentially robbed of funding year after year for decades. That explains why we see such discrepancies between the physical plant of a Tennessee State and the physical plant of a UT Knoxville. Students can tour both institutions and say they see all of the bells and whistles. They see all of the Pelotons in the gymnasium, and they see a dining hall that looks like a mall food court, right, at your predominantly white institution, and they don't always see that when they tour their Black counterpart institutions. We have to understand that the discrepancies we're seeing, right, in the physical plants, the discrepancies we're seeing in the number of dorms, the discrepancies we're seeing in the library resources come from somewhere, and they come from historic underfunding of these Black institutions. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that there is a debt that these southern state governments owe to these institutions because they essentially robbed them of necessary funds in order to preserve segregation, right? So if we think about the amount of money that the state of Tennessee owes Tennessee State today, it's no exaggeration to say we're really looking at about $7 to $8 billion. And if Tennessee paid Tennessee State the money that it owed it, Tennessee State wouldn't be in a financial crisis today. If North Carolina A&T received all of the money that North Carolina General Assembly owes it, North Carolina A&T would have enough dorms in order to admit every single qualified applicant. North Carolina A&T today is the largest HBCU in the country, and every year they turn away hundreds upon hundreds of qualified applicants. They're turning them away because they don't have the dorms. But if A&T had all of the money that the state of North Carolina owed A&T could go on a building spree, a building boom, and build, several dorms, build a bigger library, build a bigger student union to accommodate the demand. And so that's one of the reasons why I say that there's this debt owed. And the other reason that there's a debt owed is because Southern states did not have to send these Black students out of state. They could have created graduate programs at their public Black colleges. And when we think about a law school or a medical school or even a master's program, those are programs that generate tuition dollars. Those are programs that help a university to meet its bottom line. And the opportunity for these revenue generating programs was stolen from public Black colleges when Southern state governments decided to export or exile Black students rather than create programs at Black colleges. And so again, there's a debt to be paid, right? There's a harm that has to be repaired. There is a reckoning that needs to occur. And so I'm very hopeful that perhaps alumni of public Black institutions and anyone that's committed to the success of HBCUs will read the book and begin to understand why we see these financial crises at these institutions that we see in 2024. And I'm hopeful that alumni and allies and friends of HBCUs will perhaps say now is the time to make a real demand, a legal demand of Southern state governments to begin to repair the harm, to begin to pay the debt, right? And this is not an opinion. You can go into the archives and see where this money was diverted year after year from these institutions. So there's an archival trail, there's a paper trail, right? Young people would say, where are the receipts? There are receipts to show that there's a debt owed. And I'm hopeful that perhaps we will begin to have real conversations about how to pay this debt.